July 1572. A massive cloud of dust erupts on the horizon, rising like a storm ready to swallow the sky. But this is no ordinary weather event. This is something far more sinister. 120,000 riders of the Crimean Horde are thundering straight for the heart of Russia. The noise is absolutely deafening. The ground shakes under the relentless pounding of hooves. The air fills with the chilling rattle of swords, thousands of them. War cries echo in a language that sends ice straight down your spine. Moscow stinks of ash and cinders. Just 1 year earlier, in 1571, this very same horde had reduced the Russian capital to nothing but rubble and smoke. 80,000 people either perished in the flames or were dragged off into chains. The largest city in the north burned for days without end. Only the Kremlin managed to hold out, standing completely alone amidst a vast landscape of corpses and debris. Now, the direct descendants of the Golden Horde have made good on their promise to return. Their leader, Davlet Khan of Crimea, and a loyal vassal to the mighty Ottoman Empire, has a single objective: to wipe Russia off the map once and for all. He's not after tribute. He has zero interest in sitting down at the negotiating table. He wants absolute, total annihilation. Russian scouts return with intelligence that sends a chill through the ranks. The army heading their way is the largest the Horde has ever put together. 120,000 elite warriors, the finest cavalry on the face of the earth. Mounted archers who can land deadly accurate shots at a full gallop. Lancers who have smashed armies from Poland all the way to Persia. And now, they're backed by Ottoman Janissaries and Turkish artillery. Terror has Moscow in a stranglehold. Mothers hide their children away. Priests pray without rest. Soldiers check their weapons with trembling hands. Everyone knows the stories. When the Horde sweeps through, they leave absolutely nothing standing, no building intact, no soul left alive. But there's one man who refuses to bow to fear. A man who carries the title of Tsar, the first in Russian history. A man history will come to know as the Terrible, and for very good reason. Even IV has been waiting patiently for this moment, because this time, he's got a strategy. This time, he's laid a trap. This time, he has a secret weapon the Horde has never laid eyes on. A Gulyay-gorod, the walking fortress. A wall of wood on wheels, bristling with cannons and muskets. A stroke of pure genius that will transform the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. Burning question on everyone's lips. Can an army of 25,000 men really stop 120,000 riders of death? The answer is about to be written in blood. If you want to uncover how Ivan the Terrible pulled off the most calculated massacre in Russian history, how a Mongol fortress tore the world's most feared cavalry to shreds, then smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel and hit notifications. Because what you're about to witness is no simple story of desperate survival. It's the chronicle of a strategic genocide. In 1237, the Mongols swept into Russia like a biblical plague. Led by Bada Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, they flattened one principality after another. Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, was reduced to a pile of rubble. Vladimir, Moscow, Ryazan all fell. They built pyramids out of human skulls. But the conquest wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came after, the yoke. For over 2 centuries, Russian princes were forced to bow before the Khan. Year after year, caravans bursting with gold, silver, furs, and slaves headed south. The tribute was relentless. But there was something even more horrifying: the blood tribute. The Mongols demanded that noble Russian families send their sons as hostages. These children grew up in the Khan's court, learning to forget their language, their faith, their very identity. Many never made it back. Those who did returned as hollow shells of who they once were. It was the perfect strategy to break a nation's spirit. They didn't just steal wealth, they stole the future. And whenever any prince dared to rebel, the response was swift and apocalyptic. Mongol armies would appear on the horizon and wipe entire cities off the face of the earth. The message was crystal clear. Resistance equals death. In 1480, something shifted. Ivan III, grandfather of our main figure, refused to pay the tribute in the famous Great Standoff on the Ugar River. The armies faced each other for weeks, but never came to blows. The Mongols, weakened by internal strife, eventually pulled back. Russia was technically free, except it wasn't, because while the Golden Horde had fractured, its successors remained. The Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and the most powerful of them, all the Crimean Khanate. And these heirs never forgot that Russia, in their eyes, belonged to them. Ivan Vasilievich was born in 1530 amidst total chaos. His father died when he was just 3 years old. His mother was likely poisoned by the time he turned 8. The boy grew up inside the Kremlin, surrounded by power-hungry nobles fighting among themselves, ignoring him, belittling him, treating him like a pawn of no consequence. But this boy remembered everything. And when he turned 16 in 1547, he did something nobody saw coming. He crowned himself not just Grand Prince of Moscow, but Tsar of all the Russias. Tsar, the Slavic version of Caesar. Ivan wasn't just laying claim to Russia. He was claiming the mantle of the Roman Empire. He was declaring himself equal to any emperor on earth. And then he set about proving it with blood and fire. In 1552, Ivan personally led the siege of Kazan. The fortress city had withstood every Russian attempt for decades. Ivan surrounded it with 100,000 men, dug tunnels. Beneath its walls, packed those tunnels with gunpowder. The explosion was earth-shattering. Kazan fell. Ivan commissioned St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow to commemorate the victory. That iconic, colorful dome structure that today stands as a symbol of Russia. 4 years later, in 1556, Astrakhan fell as well. Ivan now controlled the entire length of the Volga River, the most vital trade artery in Eastern Europe. Russia was no longer a scattered collection of frightened principalities. It was an empire on the rise. But success awakened something dark inside Ivan. He had always been paranoid, always convinced that everyone wanted to betray him. And in 1560, when his beloved wife Anastasia died suddenly, Ivan became certain nobles had poisoned her. He was probably right. His response was to create the Opratnina in 1565. A force of 6,000 men dressed in black, riding black horses, with brooms and dog heads tied to their saddles as symbols of their mission: to sweep away traitors and bite them to death. These men had carte blanche to torture, execute, and seize property. The terror they unleashed was beyond description. Ivan even did his own killing. This is the man history remembers. Ivan the Terrible, the tyrant of the mind. But there's another side to Ivan that often gets overlooked. He was brilliant. He established Russia's first printing press. He reorganized the army, creating permanent musketeer regiments known as streltsy. He pushed Russian borders beyond the Urals into Siberia. And most crucially, he understood that technology and strategy could overcome sheer numbers. That understanding will be the key to what happens at Molodi. In the spring of 1571, Gulyay-gorod assembled a massive army in Crimea. 120,000 elite riders reinforced with Ottoman troops. His goal: prove that Russia was still vulnerable, that the Tsar could still be humiliated, just like in the old days. Ivan knew the threat was coming. He had stationed troops along the southern border, but made a fatal error. He trusted incompetent commanders and split his forces. When the horde attacked, they moved with lightning speed, bypassing the main garrisons and riding straight for Moscow. On May 24, 1571, the Tatars reached the outskirts of the capital. They set fire to the wooden suburbs surrounding the Kremlin. The flames spread with unnatural speed, whipped by dry winds. Within hours, all of Moscow was one gigantic inferno. Accounts from survivors are harrowing. Thousands died burned alive, trapped inside collapsing buildings. Thousands more were crushed. In the panic, as crowds tried to escape, the Tatars hunted the refugees like animals, seizing tens of thousands for the slave markets. When the smoke finally cleared 3 days later, Moscow had ceased to exist. Only the stone Kremlin remained standing, a solitary island in a sea of black ash. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 80,000. Some historians believe the true number was far higher. Gulyay-gorod didn't bother occupying Moscow. He didn't need to. He had made his point. The Tsar was powerless. He returned. Crimea weighed down with plunder, and tens of thousands of Russian slaves to be sold in Constantinople's markets. Then he sent a message to Ivan. Next year he would come back, and this time he wouldn't stop until Russia was reduced to ashes and the Tsar was dead. Ivan was enraged, humiliated, but above all, cornered. He knew Gulyay would make good on his promise. He knew 1572 would be the year Russia lived or died. How does an empire survive when its capital has been destroyed and its enemy vows to return with an even greater force? The answer rested with one man and a revolutionary war machine. The winter of 1572 was the longest anyone in Russia could remember. Moscow was a skeleton of ash. Hunger loomed large. But inside the Kremlin, Ivan didn't sleep. He spent his nights poring over maps, interrogating spies. This wouldn't be just a raid. It would be a war of annihilation. Ivan knew he couldn't win a conventional battle. His forces were too weak, too demoralized after the 1571 disaster. He needed something different. He needed a military miracle, or better yet, he needed to turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. The first thing Ivan did was sack every commander who had failed him in 1571. Some were publicly executed as a warning. Others were sent off to monasteries, a polite form of permanent exile. The Tsar had no time for incompetence. To replace them, Ivan chose the most capable man he had, Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky, a veteran of the wars against Kazan, a man who had spent years studying Mongol tactics because he had been their prisoner in his youth. Vorotynsky knew the enemy from the inside. He understood how they thought, how they fought, and most importantly, how they could be beaten. Ivan gave Vorotynsky absolute authority. Every soldier, every ruble, every resource of the empire was at his command. The message was simple: save Russia, or we all die trying. Vorotynsky got straight to work on a massive recruitment drive. He summoned all nobles who owed military service. He mobilized the Streltsy Ivan's professional musketeers. He armed peasants and turned them into soldiers. He hired Cossack mercenaries from the steppesmen who hated the Tatars every bit as much as any Russian, but the numbers remained bleak. Even with an all-out effort, Vorotynsky could only scrape together 20,000 to 25,000 men to face 120,000. That's a ratio of nearly 5 to 1. In an open battle on the steppes, where Tatar cavalry could maneuver freely, it would be a massacre. Vorotynsky needed to level the playing field, and he had exactly the tool to do it. The Gulyay-gorod wasn't a brand new invention. The name literally means walking city or mobile fortress. The Russians had used crude versions for decades in campaigns against Kazan basically. Large wooden shields that soldiers could carry for protection against arrows. But what Vorotynsky had in mind was something entirely different. Something nobody had ever attempted before. Picture solid wooden walls, 3 meters high, built in modular sections. Each section had wheels or could be mounted on sleds. The walls were reinforced with extra layers of wood, and in some cases, metal plates. But what was truly revolutionary were the loopholes, narrow openings at different heights, designed specifically for muskets and small cannons. Carpenters worked day and night for months, churning out hundreds of these sections. When assembled, they formed a mobile wall capable of sheltering thousands of soldiers, a fortress that could move wherever it was needed and reconfigure itself based on the terrain. Inside the Gulyay-gorod, musketeers would be safe from Tatar archery, the Horde's primary weapon. They could fire through the loopholes with impunity while staying protected. Small cannons called falconets could be mounted on elevated platforms, giving them devastating firing angles. It was a simple but brilliant concept, turning a mobile army into a walking fortress. The Tatars were masters of mobile combat encirclements, hit-and-run warfare. But what happens when the enemy simply refuses to move? When they become a hedgehog of wood and metal that can't be flanked? Vorotynsky had identified the fundamental weakness of nomadic cavalry. They needed space to maneuver. They needed the enemy to panic, break ranks, and flee. Their entire strategy depended on mobility and psychological terror. The Gulyay-gorod eliminated both advantages, but there was a catch. For the trap to work, they needed the Tatars to attack. They needed to make 120,000 riders charge those walls again and again until they bled out. That meant choosing the perfect battlefield. Vorotynsky spent weeks studying the terrain south of Moscow. He needed a spot that met several conditions at once. First, it had to lie on the natural invasion route from Crimea so the Tatars couldn't avoid it without a massive detour. Second, it needed terrain that limited enemy cavalry mobility, forests, rivers, hills nearby. Third, it had to be defensible without looking impenetrable, because if it seemed too strong, Devlet would simply bypass it. He found the perfect location near the village of Molodi, about 60 kilometers south of Moscow. The area was crisscrossed by small rivers and streams. Dense forests flanked the sides. And most importantly, a series of low hills offered excellent elevated positions for artillery. Vorotynsky designed his trap with surgical precision. He would deploy a seemingly vulnerable vanguard to lure the Tatars in. When they attacked, the vanguard would slowly pull back toward Molodi, drawing the enemy deeper and deeper. Then the main army, with the Gulyay-gorod, would reveal itself, cutting off any retreat. The Tatars would find themselves trapped between the Pakra River behind them, forests on the flanks, and a mobile fortress in front. They couldn't use their numerical superiority. They couldn't flank. They'd have to attack head-on, again and again, against muskets and cannons. It would be a slaughter, but the plan hinged on one thing: the Russian soldiers holding their formation no matter what. Because if the Gulyay-gorod broke, if the men panicked and fled, then none of this would matter. The Horde would chase them down and tear them apart, as they always had. Vorotynsky spent the final months drilling his troops obsessively. Endless exercises in assembling the Gulyay-gorod, target practice, discipline drills under stressful conditions. He made them memorize one simple rule: no matter how many Tatars come, no matter how terrifying their charges, stay inside the walls. Shoot, reload, shoot again. Because Vorotynsky understood something fundamental about war. Technology wins battles, but discipline wins wars. By early summer of 1572, everything was in place. The troops were positioned. The Gulyay-gorod was assembled and tested. Scouts were deployed along the southern border, waiting for the first signs of invasion. Ivan visited the camp one last time before returning to Moscow. He walked among the soldiers, looking into the faces of men who knew many of them wouldn't survive the coming weeks. He told them something simple: behind us is Moscow. Behind Moscow are our families. There's nowhere left to retreat. Here we stand, here we fight. And here, with God's help, we will destroy the horde forever. There were no cheers. The men just nodded. They knew what was coming. And then, at the end of July, the scouts returned riding like demons. The message was short and terrifying. The horde had crossed the border. 120,000 riders were advancing north like a dark tide. The horde had no idea what awaited them. They were coming for another easy victory, another raid, another city in flames. Instead, they would find their grave. Devlet-Gyare was no mere border raider. He was the Khan of Crimea, a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, and a vassal of the most powerful man in the world, Sultan Selim, the second of the Ottoman Empire. From his capital in Bakhchisara, Devlet considered himself the legitimate heir of the Golden Horde. He had a historic mission to restore Mongol dominion over Russia. Born around 1512, Devlet had spent decades consolidating his power. He had eliminated rivals, forged alliances with the Ottomans, and turned Crimea into the richest state on the Black Sea. His main business? The slave trade. Every year, tens of thousands of Slavic slaves passed through the markets of Kaffa captured in raids against Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. This trade filled the Khan's coffers with Ottoman gold. But Devlet wanted more than wealth. He wanted glory. He wanted his name spoken in the same breath as Bata Khan, the conqueror of Russia. And after burning Moscow in 1571, he knew he was on the verge of achieving it. The Ottoman Sultan had given his blessing and reinforcements. 7,000 elite Janissaries, modern artillery, and military advisors. The message was unmistakable. Constantinople was backing the total destruction of Russia. If Devlet succeeded, the balance of power in Eastern Europe would shift forever. The Ottoman Empire would dominate from the Mediterranean to the Urals. Devlet was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He knew the Russians would try to defend themselves this time. That's why he'd assembled the largest army the horde had fielded in generations. 120,000 warriors, a figure reported by Russian chroniclers based on intelligence from captured Tatar prisoners. For Devlet, this would be his masterpiece. He would crush any resistance, burn Moscow again, capture Ivan, and drag him in chains to Crimea, and install a puppet prince on the throne. Russia would pay tribute again. Just like in the old days, it was a flawless plan, except for one detail. He completely underestimated his enemy. The army Devlet commanded was one of the most effective fighting forces of the 16th century. The Crimean Tatars had inherited centuries of Mongol military experience and perfected it with Ottoman technology. At the core of the army were the Mirzas, the Tatar warrior nobility. These were elite riders, trained from childhood to ride and shoot simultaneously. Each Mirza commanded his own contingent of tribal warriors, men who lived in the saddle and considered war their only honorable profession. The basic Tatar tactic was simple but devastating: the feint and envelopment. Groups of mounted archers would approach the enemy at a gallop, unleash clouds of arrows, and then pull back before the enemy could respond. They repeated this over and over, wearing down and demoralizing their opponents. When the enemy finally broke formation to pursue or simply collapsed from exhaustion, that's when the killing blow came. A massive heavy cavalry charge that shredded enemy lines. This strategy had worked against Poles, Lithuanians, Hungarians, and Russians for centuries. European armies simply didn't know how to counter it. Their heavy knights were too slow. Their infantry couldn't maintain cohesion under constant arrow fire. And when they tried to take refuge in fortifications, the Tatars simply avoided them and raided the surrounding territory until they surrendered from hunger. In addition to Tatar cavalry, Devlet had Ottoman Janissaries. These were professional infantry soldiers, considered among the best in the world. Armed with state-of-the-art muskets and trained in iron discipline, the Janissaries could lay down a devastating line of fire. Their presence meant Devlet had not just cavalry superiority, but elite infantry capable of assaulting fortifications. Ottoman artillery, though limited in number, was technologically superior to anything the Russians had. Bronze cannons capable of bringing down stone walls. In open field, these cannons could fire iron balls that tore apart infantry formations. The Horde's logistical train was another crucial advantage. Unlike European armies that relied on slow, vulnerable supply lines, the Tatars traveled light. Each warrior carried dried meat, cheese, and fermented milk. Their horses grazed on the march. They could cover 100 kilometers in a single day, something impossible for any conventional army. And then there was the psychological factor. For centuries, the mere mention of the Horde had been enough to sow panic. The Tatars deliberately cultivated their reputation for cruelty. They impaled prisoners along visible roads. They burned entire villages. They captured civilian populations to sell as slaves. This terror was as much a weapon as their swords. The numbers said it all. 120,000 experienced warriors, backed by Ottoman technology, led by a Khan hungry for glory. Against this, the Russians could muster perhaps 25,000 men, many of them poorly trained peasants. By any rational military calculation, Russia had no chance. At the end of July 1572, the Horde crossed the Oka River and entered Russian territory. Devlet was in no hurry. He let his men raid border villages, capturing cattle and slaves. This served two purposes. It fed his army and sent waves of refugees fleeing north, sowing panic and overloading Russian resources. Russian scouts watched from distant forests, counting banners, estimating numbers. The reports they sent to Vorotynsky grew increasingly alarming. The Horde was even larger than feared, and they were coming straight along the main road to Moscow. Devlet was confident. His spies had told him the Russian army was small and concentrated. Near Molodi. Perfect. He would destroy them there. Then Moscow would be defenseless. Perhaps this time he wouldn't just burn the city. Perhaps he would occupy it permanently. On July 26th, the Tatar vanguard made contact with Russian scouting forces near the Oka River. There were brief skirmishes. The Russians withdrew, apparently overwhelmed. Devlet smiled. Everything was going according to plan. The next day, the main Horde army crossed the Oka and camped on the north bank. Now there were only 60 kilometers to Moscow. Devlet ordered a day of rest. He wanted his troops fresh for the battle he knew was coming. During the night, the Horde's campfires lit up the horizon like a city of lights. Russian soldiers watching from a distance felt their stomachs tighten. It was one thing to hear that 120,000 enemies were coming. It was another to see the glow of their fires stretching as far as the eye could see. On July 28th, the Horde set out again. This time they encountered more organized resistance. Russian cavalry units harassed them, firing and withdrawing. The Tatars pursued, but the Russians refused decisive engagement. They simply vanished into the forest. Devlet was slightly irritated, but not worried. This was exactly what the Russians always did. Delay, harass, wait for reinforcements that never came. Eventually, they would run out of space to retreat. What Devlet didn't know was that every kilometer he advanced brought him deeper into Vorotynsky's trap. The Russians weren't delaying out of desperation. They were deliberately guiding the Horde toward the slaughterhouse. On July 29th, Tatar scouts reported that the main Russian army was deployed near Molodi. Devlet ordered full reconnaissance. What his men saw confused them. The Russians had built some kind of wooden fortification, but it wasn't a traditional fort. It seemed mobile, modular. Devlet consulted his commanders. Some suggested bypassing the position and marching straight to Moscow, but the Khan rejected the idea. He couldn't. leave an intact Russian army in his rear. Besides, it was a small force hiding behind wood. His riders would simply surround it and burn it. He made the decision Vorotynsky had been begging him to make. He would attack Molodi with full force. He would crush the Russians in open battle, and then march triumphantly to Moscow over their corpses. It was exactly what the Russians wanted. The trap was set. The jaws were about to close. And what came next would be one of the most brutal bloodbaths of the 16th century. The dawn of July 28th brought a clear sky and suffocating heat. Russian soldiers had spent the night awake, listening to the distant rumble of 120,000 men and horses approaching. Now, with daylight, they could see them. The southern horizon had become a dark sea of movement. Tatar banners waved in the wind. The sound of thousands of hooves pounding the earth was like constant thunder, vibrating the ground beneath the defenders' feet. Some Russian soldiers prayed. Others checked their muskets with trembling hands. The veterans simply waited in silence, faces like stone. Vorotynsky watched from an elevated hill behind the Gulyay-gorod. His plan depended on staying calm and executing each phase with precision. He had deployed a vanguard of about 3,000 Russian and Cossack riders about 2 kilometers south of the main position. Their job was simple: provoke the Tatars, inflict casualties, and retreat toward the mobile fortress. By mid-morning, the Tatar vanguard made contact. They were about 10,000 light riders, scouts, and mounted archers. They stopped about 500 meters from the Russian line, assessing the situation. Then, without warning, they charged. The Russian cavalry responded exactly as planned. Mounted musketeers fired a volley that knocked dozens of Tatars from their mounts. Then they turned their horses and galloped north toward the safety of the Gulyay-gorod. The Tatars pursued them, sure this was another cowardly Russian retreat. It was then that they saw the mobile fortress up close for the first time. The wooden sections of the Gulyay-gorod stretched in a line almost a kilometer long, forming a continuous 3-meter-high barrier. Behind the walls, thousands of muskets pointed through the loopholes. At the corners and elevated points, falconets and small cannons were mounted on platforms. The entire structure was backed by the Pakra River, ensuring it couldn't be attacked. From the rear, the Russian cavalry disappeared through gates in the wall that closed immediately behind them. The pursuing Tatars suddenly found themselves 100 meters from a fortress bristling with firearms. Vorotynsky gave the order. The loopholes of the Gulyay-gorod spat fire and smoke. A storm of lead swept the Tatar riders. Men and horses fell in heaps. The survivors turned and fled in disorder, leaving more than 200 dead and wounded behind. It was a massive psychological shock. The Tatars had never seen anything like it. Their traditional hit-and-run tactics were useless against an enemy that simply refused to come out of its shell. Getting close meant entering a death zone where muskets shredded them by afternoon. The bulk of Devlet's army had arrived. The Khan rode forward to personally inspect the Russian position. What he saw filled him with frustration. The Russians had chosen their ground perfectly. Flanking the fortress would mean crossing dense forests where cavalry couldn't maneuver. Attacking head-on would mean charging straight into a wall of fire. But Devlet had 120,000 men. He could afford casualties. He ordered a large-scale assault for the end of the day, 10,000 riders in successive waves. He would overwhelm the Russian position with sheer human mass. The first wave attacked at dusk. Thousands of Tatar riders charged at full gallop, firing arrows as they advanced. Arrows rained down on the Gulyay-gorod, but most stuck harmlessly in the wooden walls. Some passed through the loopholes, wounding or killing unlucky defenders. But the structure absorbed the vast majority of the punishment. When the attackers reached 50 meters, the Russian muskets opened fire. The first line of Tatars vanished in a cloud of smoke and blood. Those coming behind stumbled over the corpses of their comrades and dead horses. Chaos was total. A second wave attacked, then a third. Each time, the result was the same. The Tatars couldn't close the distance. The few who managed to reach the walls found there was no way to climb them, while defenders fired down from above. Some tried to set fire to the wood, but the sections were damp and reinforced specifically designed to resist flames. When darkness fell, Devlet ordered a halt. He had lost approximately 1,000 men and achieved absolutely nothing. The Russians, protected behind their walls, had suffered fewer than 100 casualties. That night, the Tatars camped in a circle around the Russian position at a safe distance from musket range. Their campfires illuminated thousands of grim faces. Warriors who had spent their entire lives on horseback, dominating battles with speed and mobility, now found themselves powerless before a wooden wall. Inside the Gulyay-gorod, the Russians worked feverishly repairing damaged sections, redistributing ammunition, tending to the wounded. Vorotynsky walked among the troops, congratulating them. The first day had been a resounding success, but he knew the worst was yet to come. Devlet wouldn't withdraw. His pride, his reputation, everything was at stake. He would attack again, and next time, he would come with everything. The second day began with a bombardment. Devlet had brought the Ottoman artillery to the front during the night, a dozen bronze cannons, each capable of firing 6-kilogram iron balls. At 8 o'clock in the morning, they opened fire. The sound was deafening. Cannonballs whistled through the air and struck the Gulyay-gorod with impacts that shook the earth. Some pierced the wooden walls, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. An entire section collapsed when 3 balls hit it simultaneously, killing a dozen men. But Vorotynsky had anticipated this. He had reinforced critical sections with additional layers of wood and packed earth. And crucially, he had positioned his own cannons to respond. The Russian gunners, though outnumbered, were accurate. They managed to destroy 2 Ottoman cannons and force the others to retreat. After 2 hours of bombardment, Devlet ordered the main assault. This time, it wouldn't be just riders. The Janissaries would go into action. 4,000 Ottoman infantry advanced in close formation, muskets ready. Behind them came 20,000 Tatar riders, waiting to exploit any breach. It was the classic Ottoman combined tactic: infantry to break lines, cavalry to exploit. The Janissaries advanced with professional discipline under intense fire. When they reached 100 meters, they stopped, formed lines, and discharged their muskets against the Gulyay-gorod. It was the first time in the battle the Russians had faced concentrated musket fire. Dozens of defenders fell, riddled with Ottoman bullets. But the Russians had more muskets. Far more. As the Janissaries reloaded, the defenders unleashed volley after volley. The Ottoman formation began to unravel. Men fell by the dozens. Officers shouted orders, trying to maintain cohesion. But the slaughter was relentless. Then, the Janissaries charged with bayonets. It was a desperate but brave move. Some managed to reach the walls and begin climbing. For a few terrifying moments, it seemed they might break the line. Vorotynsky responded by moving reserves to the threatened section. Russian soldiers fought hand-to-hand at the top of the walls, pushing ladders, stabbing down with pikes, firing muskets at point-blank range. The fight was savage and desperate. Then Russian cannons fired grapeshot directly into the Janissaries, clustered at the base of the walls. The effect was catastrophic. Hundreds of Ottomans were shredded in seconds. The survivors broke and fled. The Tatar riders tried to take advantage of the confusion and charge, but found themselves riding straight into Russian fire without infantry support. It was a massacre. Corpses piled so high in front of certain wall sections that they obstructed later attacks. By noon, Devlet had lost more than 3,000 men, including nearly 1,000 Janissaries. The Russians had suffered about 400 casualties many in the desperate fight against the Janissaries. But most importantly, the mobile fortress remained intact. Not a single section had broken. The Russians kept firing with the same deadly intensity. Devlet was furious, but also beginning to worry. He had expected to crush the Russians in one day, 2 at most. But now, at the end of the second day, his army was bleeding out while the Russians stayed safe behind their walls. Every hour that passed, his numerical advantage meant less. He ordered a complete encirclement. If he couldn't break the Gulyay-gorod with frontal attacks, he would do it by starvation. He would cut Russian supplies and force them to come out or die of hunger. But implementing an effective encirclement against a river-backed fortress was difficult. And Vorotynsky had been sending messengers to Moscow requesting reinforcements. Small groups of Cossacks slipped through Tatar lines at night, bringing ammunition and food. The battle had become a test of wills. Devlet bet that the Russians would eventually collapse. Vorotynsky bet that the horde would bleed out first. That night, both commanders knew the next day would be critical. The third day brought scorching heat. The stench of thousands of corpses rotting under the sun was unbearable. Flies covered everything. In black clouds, the wounded groaned in agony. But no one could stop. The battle continued. Devlet E.T. decided to change tactics. Mass attacks weren't working. Instead, he ordered continuous day and night attacks in rotation. He would keep the Russians under constant pressure, giving them no rest. Eventually, exhaustion would break them. It began at dawn with an attack of 5,000 riders against the western flank of the Gulyay-gorod. 2 hours later, another attack struck the eastern flank, then the center, then the west again. The attacks never ceased. The moment one was repelled, another began in a different sector. It was exhausting for the defenders. They couldn't lower their guard for a moment. They fired, reloaded, fired again, until their shoulders were black with bruises from musket recoil. Their ears bled from the constant noise. Their eyes burned from smoke, but Russian discipline held. Vorotynsky had organized a rotation system where fresh units replaced exhausted ones every few hours. Men could rest, eat, sleep briefly before returning to the line. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. The Tatars, on the other hand, were beginning to suffer more serious problems. Morale was falling. Warriors who had come expecting easy loot and glory now saw only senseless death. Some Mirzas began openly questioning Devlet's strategy. Moreover, the horde supplies were starting to run out. An army of 120,000 men and horses consumes massive amounts of food and water daily. They had looted the surrounding area, but Vorotynsky had ordered all nearby villages evacuated weeks earlier. There was nothing left to take. In mid-afternoon, Devlet ordered a final massive assault for the day. 30,000 riders would attack the center of the Gulyay-gorod simultaneously, supported by the remaining Janissaries. They would break the Russian lines or die trying. The charge was spectacular and terrifying. Thousands of Tatar riders galloped straight toward the walls, shouting their war cries, firing arrows in black clouds. The Janissaries advanced behind, discharging coordinated volleys. Russian fire reached infernal levels. Muskets fired so fast that the metal barrels became too hot to touch. Gunners loaded grapeshot into cannons and fired directly into the masses of attackers. The slaughter was indescribable. Hundreds of Tatars fell every minute. Horses, maddened by noise and the smell of blood, reared and threw their riders. The wounded were trampled by those coming behind. The ground in front of the Gulyay-gorod became a swamp of blood and mud. Some attackers managed to reach the walls. Desperate fights broke out at half a dozen points. Russian pikes clashed against Tatar swords. Men fell from the walls pierced by spears. Stones and boiling oil rained down on the attackers, but the walls held. And after an hour of brutal combat, the attackers retreated again, leaving more than 2,000 dead. When darkness fell on the third day, Devlet had lost approximately 6,000 men in total. The Russians had lost around 800. The casualty ratio was catastrophic for the Tatars, but they still had a huge numerical advantage. However, something had changed. The Russian soldiers who began the battle terrified, now felt confident. They had held for 3 days against the most feared force in the world. They had killed thousands without being defeated. They began to believe they could win, and Vorotynsky knew it was time to shift from defense to offense. The trap had worked. The Tatars were bleeding. Now was the time to close the jaws and crush them completely. The morning of the fourth day brought a change in Tatar tactics. Devlet finally accepted that frontal attacks were suicidal. He had lost 6,000 men against wooden walls and had nothing to show for it except mountains of corpses. Now he would try what he should have done from the beginning, a complete encirclement. He ordered his commanders to deploy the army in a gigantic ring around the Gulyay-gorod. Detachments of 10,000 riders patrolled constantly, intercepting any Russian attempt to bring supplies or send messengers. Ottoman artillery maintained intermittent bombardment not to break the walls, but to keep the defenders exhausted and nervous. It was a solid strategy in theory. With 114,000 men still available, Devlet could afford to completely surround the Russian position and simply wait. Without food or water, the Russians would have to surrender or starve. But there was a critical problem Devlet hadn't fully considered. The Pakra River flowed directly behind the Gulyay-gorod. The Russians had unlimited access to fresh water, and Vorotynsky had been smart enough to store food inside the defensive perimeter before the battle. He had supplies for at least 2 weeks. Devlet, on the other hand, had increasingly serious supply problems. His foragers had cleaned the surrounding area of food in the first days. Now foraging patrols had to travel farther and farther, making them vulnerable to Cossack ambushes. The Tatar horses, the soul of their army, were beginning to weaken from lack of proper forage. Moreover, dysentery had begun to spread through the Tatar camp. With more than 100,000 men camped in a relatively small area, sanitary conditions were horrible. Unburied corpses from previous days made it worse. Hundreds of warriors fell ill daily. During these 2 days, Devlet ordered night attacks to maintain psychological pressure on the Russians. Groups of 1,000 or 2,000 riders attacked in the dark, firing incendiary arrows, shouting, trying to sow panic. Russian defenders responded with musket volleys into the shadows, wasting ammunition on barely visible targets. But Vorotynsky didn't sit idle. He organized his own night raids. Groups of 200 or 300 Cossacks and elite soldiers slipped out of the Gulyay-gorod in darkness. They attacked sections of the Tatar camp, killed sleeping guards, set fire to tents, and disappeared before an effective response could be organized. These raids had a disproportionate effect on Tatar morale. Warriors who had spent the day attacking the walls now couldn't sleep at night, fearing they'd have their throats slit in the dark. Accumulated exhaustion began to break discipline. On the 5th day, Vorotynsky received reinforcements. 2,000 fresh musketeers from Moscow had managed to infiltrate through Tatar lines at night, guided by Cossacks who knew every path and stream. It wasn't many, but their arrival greatly boosted Russian morale. It meant Moscow hadn't abandoned them, that the Tsar still believed in victory. Devlet intercepted some of these reinforcement groups and massacred them, but enough got through to worry him. If the Russians could bring reinforcements continuously, his numerical advantage would gradually erode. He needed to force a quick decision in the afternoon of the 5th day, He called a war council with his main commanders. The discussion was heated. Some Mirzas argued they should withdraw. They had suffered more than 7,000 casualties and had nothing to show for it. The campaign was a disaster. Better to return to Crimea, regroup, and come back next year. Others argued that withdrawing now would be a catastrophic humiliation. How would they explain to the Ottoman Sultan that 120,000 warriors had been stopped by 25,000 Russians hiding behind wooden walls? Ridicule would haunt them for generations. Devlet made the decision. One last massive assault. The next day, he would launch 50,000 warriors simultaneously against the Gulyay-gorod from all sides. They would overwhelm the Russian defenses by sheer mass. And this time, he would personally lead the final charge. But what Devlet didn't know was that Vorotynsky was also planning something. Something that would completely change the course of the battle. The morning of the sixth day brought thick fog. The Tatars, accustomed to combat on open steppes under clear skies, felt uneasy. They couldn't see the enemy. They couldn't assess their movements. Vorotynsky had been waiting for exactly these conditions. He had noticed the morning fog pattern in previous days. And now, with the horde preparing for its massive assault, it was the perfect time to strike first at 5 o'clock in the morning. While most of the Tatar camp was still sleeping, the gates of the Gulyay-gorod opened. 5,000 Russian soldiers emerged in absolute silence, divided into 10 columns of 500 men each. They were Vorotynsky's best troops, Streltsy veterans, Don Cossacks, and nobles in full armor. The columns advanced through the fog like ghosts. Tatar guards didn't see them until it was too late. Russian bayonets struck silently, slitting sentries' throats before they could scream. Within minutes, the Russians were inside the camp perimeter. Then the massacre began. Russian muskets opened fire at point-blank range into tents full of sleeping warriors. The explosions awoke the camp in total chaos. Half-naked men stumbled out of tents, searching for weapons, not understanding what was happening. The Russians killed them systematically, moving from tent to tent. The fog amplified the confusion. Tatars fired into shadows, frequently killing their own comrades. They couldn't organize. They couldn't form defensive lines. It was guerrilla combat in the heart of their own camp. One Russian column reached the horse corrals. They killed the guards, then shot the animals or scattered them in panic. Thousands of Tatar horses fled, galloping into the steppes, taking with them the mobility that was the heart of the horde's military power. Another column reached the Tatar supply train and set fire to food and ammunition wagons. Flames rose to the sky, visible even through the fog, a beacon of destruction. Devlet, awakened by the chaos, desperately tried to organize a response. He gathered his personal guard, about 2,000 elite riders, and charged toward where he thought the Russians were. But in the fog, he simply galloped in circles while his men were killed around him. After 2 hours of chaotic combat, Vorotynsky sounded the retreat horn. The Russian columns disengaged and ran back to the Gulyay-gorod, carrying prisoners captured, weapons, and Tatar banners as trophies. When the fog lifted at noon, Devlet could finally assess the damage. It was catastrophic. Approximately 10,000 of his warriors lay dead, many killed while sleeping. Thousands of horses had disappeared. His supply train was destroyed. And worst of all, his army's morale was shattered. The Russians, on the other hand, had lost fewer than 300 men in the raid. It was a brilliant tactical victory that completely changed the psychological balance of the battle. The defenders had become attackers. The cornered Russians had sallied out and struck the giant. But Devlet couldn't withdraw now, not after so much bloodshed. He ordered the massive assault to continue as planned. 50,000 warriors would attack. That same afternoon, it was at that moment that news arrived that would change everything. Scouts reported dust columns to the north. A Russian reinforcement army was approaching. 5,000 men under Prince Dmitry Kvarostinin, an aggressive commander, known for his audacity. Devlet now faced a strategic nightmare. If he launched his massive assault against the Gulyay-gorod, he would leave his rear exposed to the Russian reinforcements. But if he divided his forces to face Kvarostinin, he would fatally weaken his main attack. He made the most sensible decision: divide his army. 30,000 would remain besieging the Gulyay-gorod. The other 84,000 would march north to destroy the reinforcements before they could join Vorotynsky. It was exactly what the Russians wanted. Vorotynsky and Kvarostinin had coordinated this perfectly. The reinforcements weren't coming to shelter in the Gulyay-gorod. They were coming to be the hammer against the anvil. The seventh day began with Devlet leading 84,000 warriors north to intercept Kvarostinin. He engaged them 15 kilometers from Molodi, in an area of rolling hills and scattered forests. Kvarostinin, a brilliant commander, had chosen his position carefully. He deployed his 5,000 men on the slopes of a wooded hill with dense forest at his back, providing an escape route if needed. He had some light cannons and enough muskets to make any attack costly. Devlet ordered an immediate attack. He was furious, frustrated, and making mistakes. He launched wave after wave of cavalry against Kvarostinin's position. The Russians shredded them with disciplined fire, yielding ground slowly, but inflicting horrible casualties. Meanwhile, at Molodi, Vorotynsky saw his opportunity. The 30,000 Tatars left besieging the Gulyay-gorod were insufficient to maintain an effective encirclement. He opened all the gates of the mobile fortress and launched his entire army against them. It was a wild, desperate charge. 20,000 Russian soldiers sallied out, shouting, firing muskets at point-blank range, striking with pikes and swords. The Tatars, taken completely by surprise, broke ranks almost immediately. What followed was a relentless pursuit. The Russians took no prisoners. They hunted the retreating Tatars through forests and streams, killing anyone they could reach. The Cossacks in particular were merciless, remembering centuries of Tatar raids against their people. Vorotynsky then did something bold to the point of recklessness. He left a rear guard force to protect the Gulyay-gorod and marched north, 15,000 men, to join Kvarostinin. The pincers were closing on Devlet. When the two Russian armies united in mid-afternoon, Devlet found himself in an impossible position. He was being attacked from two directions. His army, after days of non-stop combat, was exhausted. The horses were spent. Supplies had run out. And now the Russians who were supposedly cornered were enveloping him. The Khan tried to organize an orderly retreat. But when an army of 100,000 begins to retreat, especially one that has lost confidence in its leader, retreat quickly becomes rout. And when panic sets in, rout becomes annihilation. What happened in the following hours was one of the most spectacular bloodbaths of the 16th century. The Russians pursued the retreating horde for kilometers. Tatars on exhausted horses couldn't flee fast enough. Columns of fugitives became perfect targets for Russian muskets. Streams and rivers became deadly traps. Thousands of Tatars tried to cross the Pakra River simultaneously. They pushed each other into the water. Many drowned under the weight of their armor. Those who managed to cross were shot down by musket fire from the opposite bank. The forests the Tatars hoped would provide cover became mazes of death. Cossacks experts in forest combat hunted them among the trees. Groups of Tatars surrendered, only to be summarily executed. Russian thirst for revenge for centuries of humiliation had been unleashed, and it was unstoppable. Devlet, the proud Khan of Crimea, fled with barely 6,000 survivors of his personal guard. He abandoned his tent, his banners, his artillery, everything. His only concern was to escape alive. When darkness fell on the seventh day, the pursuit finally ended. The Russian soldiers were too exhausted to continue, but the damage was done. The battlefield and surrounding areas were covered with between 30,000 and 40,000 Tatar corpses. Some historians suggest the actual figures were even higher, possibly 50,000 or more, when counting those who died in the following days from wounds. According to Russian chroniclers, the Pakra River ran red, with blood for days. Wolves and crows feasted for weeks. The stench was so terrible that villages within 15 kilometers had to be temporarily evacuated. The Crimean Horde, the most feared military force in Eastern Europe, had been shattered. Of the 120,000 warriors who had confidently marched toward Moscow, fewer than 20,000 returned to Crimea. The rest lay dead in the fields around Molodi, or had been captured. The Battle of Molodi was over, and with it, the Mongol threat to Russia was over forever. Devlet. Guray's flight was pathetic for a man who had burned Moscow just 1 year earlier. The Khan, surrounded by the shattered remnants of his personal guard, rode day and night south. He didn't stop to eat. He didn't stop to sleep. The terror of being captured by the Russians kept him moving. Cossacks pursued him for days, hunting. Stragglers like wolves stalking a wounded pack. Groups of exhausted Tatars on dying horses were overtaken and massacred. Some tried to surrender, offering ransom, begging for mercy. They received none. The Cossacks remembered too many burned villages, too many enslaved families. When Devlet finally crossed the Don and reached safe territory, only between 10,000 and 20,000 men remained with him. From an army of 120,000, it was a loss rate of 80 to 90%. In military terms, it wasn't just a defeat. It was an extermination. The wounded were abandoned on the road. No medical supplies, no transport. They were simply left to die on the steppes. Russian villagers who found these men showed no mercy. Centuries of Mongol terror had hardened their hearts. Captured prisoners faced varied fates. Tatar nobles and Ottoman Janissaries were taken to Moscow in chains. Even paraded them publicly through the streets as trophies. Some were executed in elaborate public ceremonies, impaled or beheaded before celebrating crowds. Others were ransomed for huge sums that filled Russia's empty treasury. Common warriors who were captured were sold as slaves or forced to work on construction projects. Ironically, many ended up building the new fortifications that would protect Russia from future invasions. The captured booty was massive. Thousands of horses, hundreds of supply wagons, Ottoman artillery, weapons, armor, war banners. The banners were hung in St. Basil's Cathedral as permanent reminders of the victory. Some are still preserved in Russian museums today, but the true booty was intangible. The horde had been psychologically broken. The aura of invincibility that had terrified Eastern Europe for centuries evaporated in 7 days of carnage. When the first messengers reached Moscow with news of the victory, people simply didn't believe it. It seemed too good to be true. The horde, the same horde that had burned the capital the previous year, had been annihilated. But when more messengers arrived, bringing captured banners and chained prisoners, reality sank in. Moscow erupted in celebrations. Bells rang in all churches for days. Religious processions filled the streets. 3 days of national holiday were declared. Ivan the Terrible ordered Thanksgiving services in every church in the country. He proclaimed that the victory was proof of divine favor upon Russia. God had chosen the Russians to defeat the infidel Mongols. The Tsar generously rewarded Vorotynsky. He granted him lands, titles. Other commanders were also rewarded according to their contribution. Rank-and-file soldiers received cash bonuses and land. Many peasants who fought at Molodi were freed from serfdom as a reward. It was an unprecedented gesture that further elevated Ivan's prestige. Commemorative churches were ordered built in Molodi and Moscow. One of these, the Church of the Intercession of the Mother of God, was built on the exact site where the Gulyay-gorod had stood. It became a place of pilgrimage. Russian chroniclers worked feverishly to document the battle. Their accounts, though often exaggerated, preserved the basic details of how an inferior force defeated a massive enemy through technological innovation and tactical brilliance. News of Molodi reached Constantinople like lightning. Sultan Selim II was furious. He had invested significant resources in Devlet's campaign. Janissaries, artillery, advisors, and all had been destroyed or captured. The captured Janissaries, eventually ransomed, brought humiliating reports. They told how a wooden fortress had stopped the largest army Crimea had ever assembled, how Russian muskets had shredded them, how their proud cavalry had been reduced to piled corpses. Selim ordered a full investigation. How had this happened? Ottoman military reports concluded that Devlet had committed fundamental tactical errors, attacking a fortified position without proper reconnaissance, underestimating Russian capabilities, failing to secure supply lines. But the most important conclusion was strategic. The era of dominant nomadic cavalry was over. Firearms and mobile fortifications had fundamentally changed the balance of power. The Ottomans needed to adapt their own tactics or face similar defeats. Ottoman support for Crimea was drastically reduced after Molodi. Selim had his own problems, wars in the Mediterranean, rebellions in the Balkans. He couldn't afford to waste more resources on failed Crimean adventures. Devlet received a cold letter from the Sultan, basically blaming him for the debacle and warning that he shouldn't expect significant further help. The Khan, now humiliated and weakened, spent the rest of his reign trying to rebuild his army. He never regained his former strength. Throughout Eastern Europe, the balance of power shifted. Poland and Lithuania, which had lived in constant fear of Tatar raids, saw that the monster could be defeated. They began adopting similar tactics, building mobile fortifications and emphasizing firepower over heavy cavalry. Venetian and Genoese merchants on the Black Sea reported that slave prices skyrocketed because Tatar raids had almost completely ceased. The source of slaves that had fed Mediterranean markets for centuries had suddenly dried up. Russian diplomacy was transformed. European embassies in Moscow began treating Ivan with new respect. He was no longer the ruler of a marginal, barbaric principality. He was the Tsar who broke the horde. He was someone who could be a valuable ally or a dangerous enemy. England in particular sought closer relations. The Muscovy Company dramatically expanded trade. English military advisors arrived to study the Gulyay-gorod and other Russian innovations. Molodi had announced that Russia was a major European power, no longer to be ignored or scorned. The giant of the East had awakened, and it had done so in the most violent and bloody way possible. Molodi was not simply a battle. It was the endpoint of an era that had lasted almost 3.5 centuries. Since Batu Khan ravaged Russia in 1237, Slavic peoples had lived under the shadow of Mongol terror. Entire generations were born, lived, and died without knowing. A single day of true freedom from tribute, raids, and constant humiliation. After August 3, 1572, that shadow disappeared forever. Devlet Chairay attempted one last raid in 1573, but it was a pathetic force of barely 15,000 men, a fraction of his former power. The Russians repelled them easily, without even needing the Gulyay-gorod. The Khan died in 1577, a broken man who had seen his dream of restoring the Golden Horde die in the fields of Molodi. His successors never attempted another large-scale invasion. They simply lacked the capacity. Crimea's warrior elite, the experienced Mirzas who had formed the core of Tatar military power, had been annihilated. It would take generations to replace them, and by then, The technological balance had irrevocably shifted in favor of states with firearms. Tatar raids continued, of course, but they were small operations, glorified banditry, not the apocalyptic invasions of the past, and with each passing decade, they became less frequent and less successful. Russia built a line of fortifications along its southern border, the Abati Line, turning the steppes into a militarized zone where Tatars could no longer operate with impunity. By 1783, Catherine the Great simply annexed the Crimean Khanate. To the Russian Empire, the wheel had turned completely. Descendants of the Mongol conquerors were now subjects of the empire they once dominated. But Molodi did more than end the military threat. It freed Russian national energy for expansion. With the southern border finally secure, Ivan and his successors could look east. The conquest of Siberia accelerated dramatically after 1572. In less than a century, Russia would stretch from Poland to the Pacific Ocean, becoming the largest territorial empire the world had ever seen. Molodi was, in many ways, the birth of Russia as a superpower. The country that had been trampled and humiliated for centuries suddenly found itself free to pursue its own destiny. And that destiny proved imperial, on a scale even Ivan could barely. Imagine the mobile fortress that saved Russia at Molodi deserves a place in the history of military innovation alongside tanks, airplanes, and nuclear weapons, because the Gulyay-gorod represented something revolutionary: the ability to combine strategic mobility with impenetrable tactical defense. Before Molodi, armies faced a fundamental trade-off. You could build massive fortifications that were practically impregnable, but then you were static, unable to project power. Or you could have a mobile army that could maneuver, but then you were vulnerable in open field battles, especially against superior cavalry. The Gulyay-gorod broke that paradigm. Vorotynsky had created a fortress that could move where needed, and then instantly become a formidable defensive position. It was the 16th century equivalent of a tank, mobile protection combined with massive firepower. Modern military historians who have studied Molodi are amazed at how advanced the concept was. 20th century mechanized forces operated under surprisingly similar principles. Use mobility to reach a favorable position, then use protection and firepower to destroy the enemy. So why didn't the Gulyay-gorod revolutionize European warfare? Why are there no massive references to it in Western military treatises? The answer is partly geographical. The Gulyay-gorod worked brilliantly on the open steppes and forests of Eastern Europe, where terrain allowed deployment of large modular structures. But in the mountains of Italy, the swampy Low Countries, or the dense forests of Germany, it was much less practical. It was also a matter of military culture. Western European armies were heavily investing in permanent fortifications and siege artillery. The dominant model of war was prolonged siege, not open field battle against nomadic hordes. They didn't need the Gulyay-gorod because they didn't face the type of enemy it was designed against. But the Russians continued using it for decades after Molodi. Improved versions of the Gulyay-gorod appeared in campaigns against Sweden, Poland, and the Siberian Khanates. Each generation of Russian military engineers refined it, making it lighter, stronger, more modular. Eventually, technological progress made it obsolete. Artillery improved to the point where it could shatter. Even reinforced mobile fortifications. Infantry tactics evolved toward linear formations that could produce massive firepower without needing static protection. But during a crucial moment in history, the Gulyay-gorod was the difference between Russia's survival and extinction. That moment was enough. Molodi poses an uncomfortable question about Ivan the Terrible. How do we judge a man who saved his nation but terrorized his own people? Because Ivan didn't become less terrible after Molodi. If anything, he became worse. The last years of his reign were a downward spiral of paranoia, violence, and destruction. In 1570, a year before the Moscow disaster, Ivan had sacked Novgorod, massacring between 3,000 and 10,000 of his own citizens based on unfounded suspicions of treason. In 1581, as mentioned earlier, he killed his own son in a fit of rage. The dynasty he had built almost died with him. When Ivan finally died in 1584, he left Russia in chaos. His surviving son, Theodore, was mentally weak. The period that followed the time of troubles almost destroyed the country Ivan had saved, yet the Russians never forgot Molodi. Even during Ivan's worst excesses, chroniclers continued writing about the great victory, because Ivan, with all his monstrous flaws, had achieved something no previous Russian ruler had managed. He had completely freed Russia from the horde. Modern Russian historians are divided about Ivan. Some see him as a psychopathic tyrant whose paranoia and cruelty almost destroyed the country. Others argue that his brutality, though excessive, was necessary to consolidate central power in a period of precarious national existence. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Ivan was a deeply damaged man from childhood trauma, brilliant but unstable, capable of strategic vision, but also impulsive cruelty. He was a product of his time, an era when violence was the currency of politics, and compassion was considered weakness. But one thing is undeniable. Without Ivan, without his willingness to trust Vorotynsky, without his understanding that technology could defeat numerical superiority, Molodi would not have happened. And without Molodi, Russia as we know it probably would not exist. It's a complicated legacy, but history is rarely simple. What can Molodi teach us more than 4 centuries later? There are lessons applicable to our modern world. The first lesson is about innovation under pressure. Vorotynsky didn't invent the Gulyay-gorod from scratch. He took an existing concept and brilliantly adapted it to solve a specific problem. In times of crisis, smart incremental innovation often defeats the search for completely new solutions. The second lesson is about turning weaknesses into strengths. The Russians knew they couldn't match the Tatars in speed or maneuverability, so they changed the rules. They forced the Tatars to fight the kind of battle where Russian advantages, discipline, and firepower mattered more than Tatar numerical superiority. The third lesson is about leadership. Vorotynsky understood that technology alone doesn't win battles. You need soldiers who maintain discipline under extreme pressure. He spent months training his troops not just in technique, but in psychological resilience. When the moment came, his men didn't break. And that discipline was as important as the Gulyay-gorod itself. The fourth lesson is about the nature of historical change. Molodi fundamentally changed the balance of power in Eastern Europe, but very few contemporary Western Europeans noticed. It happened on the periphery, far from established centers of power, yet its effects reverberated for centuries. History is not always made in the places historians are watching. Sometimes the most important events happen in obscure places, decided by people no one has heard of, using methods no one understands until much later. 120,000 warriors marched toward Molodi in July of 1572. Fewer than 20,000 returned. The rest remained dead in the fields, drowned in rivers, or marching in chains to Moscow. It was one of the most disproportionate victories in military history. An army outnumbered 5-1 not only survived, but annihilated its enemy. It did so through strategic brilliance, technological innovation, and inflexible courage. But more than that, Molodi was the day Russia finally rose from its knees. For 2 full years, the Russian people had paid tribute, sent their sons as hostages, watched their cities burn. For 240 years, they had lived in fear. In 7 days of carnage in August of 1572, that fear died, the shadow of the horde that had darkened Eastern Europe for centuries finally dissipated. Molodi is not as famous as it should be. There are no big Hollywood movies about it. It doesn't appear in most Western textbooks. But to understand Russian history, to understand how a besieged principality became an empire stretching from Europe To the Pacific, you must understand Molodi, because on those fields, in that forest, behind those wooden walls, the future was decided, not with speeches or treaties, but with blood and fire, and an unbreakable will to survive.